The night the chapel doors were sealed, the air inside Savannah turned strangely heavy, as if the whole city understood something had gone wrong behind those limestone walls. Records speak of a disciplined religious institution, an order of strict men sworn to obedience, purity, and absolute loyalty to the hierarchy. But one man, Brother Marcel, 51, feared by every novice for his iron authority, shattered that facade when he stepped forward with a declaration that split the brotherhood in half. He claimed a divine revelation. He claimed a miracle that no doctrine could contain. And a young enslaved man, only 17, brilliant, quiet, observant, was pulled into the center of it, not by scandalous acts, but by a dangerous mixture of manipulation, desperation, and the raw hunger for power disguised as holiness. Men who witnessed it later whispered that the real story wasn't about faith at all. It was about control, and the terrifying things men do when they believe God is on their side. If you love dark historical mysteries told with cinematic depth and real human tension, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and drop your city in the comments. Always curious where you're watching from. Now, let's break down how this documentary will unfold. The monastery woke before dawn, but that morning every man felt something strange humming beneath the stone arches, a tension sharp enough to taste like cold iron pressed against the back of the tongue. Brother Aldrin moved through the corridor with his usual steady pace, yet even he caught himself glancing at the chapel door, wondering why Brother Marcel had locked himself inside long before morning prayers began. Men who lived under strict vows rarely questioned routine, but routine had begun slipping ever since Marcel claimed he'd received a vision, one so unsettling it left veterans of the order whispering in corners after lights out. The bell rang with its hollow bronze echo, but Brother Rowan hesitated, gripping the rope as if it might burn him, remembering how Marcel's voice cracked last night when he warned of an approaching revelation. Brother Marcel had always been the spine of the order, a man woven from discipline and silence, but something inside him had changed. His eyes to bright, his hands trembling as though carrying invisible weight. Even the novices sensed danger. Young men and used to fear found themselves speaking in hushed tones, watching the elders for cues, uncertain why their sanctuary suddenly felt more like a pressure chamber. When the chapel door finally opened, Marcel emerged pale as candle smoke, clutching a rolled parchment that shook in his grip, his breath shallow, his eyes unfocused like he'd left half of himself inside. He walked past the others without speaking, the parchment pressed to his chest, and every man who saw him felt the quiet certainty that the order's foundation had begun to fracture. According to the monastery's records, that was the first morning Brother Marcel ignored the liturgy entirely, choosing instead to pace the east cloister, whispering prayers that didn't match any known doctrine. Brother Aldrin watched from a distance, uneasy, noticing how Marcel occasionally stopped to touch the walls, fingers tracing grooves, as if searching for hidden meaning carved centuries before their arrival. No one approached him, not yet. There was a protocol for men unraveling under spiritual strain, but Marcel was different, to respected, to feared, to steeped in authority, to confront without absolute certainty. The abbots convened quietly, gathering in a dim council chamber lit by a single wavering lantern, their discussions simmering with dread as they debated whether Marcel's claim of revelation had crossed into danger. Meanwhile, the monastery's young scribe, Elias, observed everything with unsettling clarity, recording shifts in schedule, deviations in prayer patterns, and Marcel's new habit of retreating to the archive tower after midnight. Elias had admired Marcel once, drawn to the older man's severity, but that admiration curdled into concern as he watched him whisper to shelves of forbidden manuscripts locked behind rusted iron doors. Rumors spread not through spoken words but through glances exchanged during meals, spoons pausing in midair when Marcel entered the hall, men straightening their posture as though bracing for impact. That tension only grew when Brother Thane discovered Marcel's cot untouched 3 mornings in a row, blankets folded with military precision, pillow still cold, proving he hadn't slept in the dormitory at all. Thane reported it reluctantly, knowing any accusation against Marcel carried weight capable of crushing the wrong man, but duty outweighed fear, and the abbots needed every piece of truth they could gather. At dusk, heavy clouds rolled over the monastery, sinking the halls into premature darkness as Marcel lit 3 candles in the refectory and unrolled the parchment he'd guarded like a living heart. Men who witnessed it later said the markings weren't scripture, nor maps, nor diagrams. They looked like frantic patterns of symbols layered over one another, as if drawn in a moment of fevered certainty. Marcel claimed the symbols came from his vision, insisting they described a trial the order must face, a reckoning meant only for men willing to confront the truth buried beneath their discipline. When Brother Rowan stepped closer to look, Marcel snapped at him, a harsh sound that silenced the entire room, revealing the first visible crack in his control, raw, vulnerable fear bleeding through. The abbots arrived moments later, dismissing the younger men to their quarters, but whispers still leaked down the corridor, carried by nervous breaths and boots shifting on cold stone floors. Inside the council chamber, Marcel argued with the senior brothers, his voice rising, his hands shaking, insisting the symbols carried divine weight capable of reshaping their entire understanding of duty. Records show the confrontation lasted hours, ending with the abbots demanding Marcel relinquish the parchment for examination, a request that made him stagger backward like struck by unseen force. He refused, gripping the parchment so tightly his knuckles blanched, declaring that no man was worthy to interpret it but him, that others would only twist its meaning into something safe. Brother Aldrin, steady and patient as always, attempted calm reasoning, but Marcel's eyes burned with something deeper, conviction sharpened into obsession, faith tangled with pride until indistinguishable. By midnight, Marcel vanished again, leaving only the echo of his boots and a trail of candle wax dripped across the stone floor, leading back toward the archive tower. Elias followed the trail at a distance, heart pounding, breath shallow, sensing the moment had shifted from unusual to dangerous, the kind of danger men recognized in their bones before their minds. Wine battered the shutters as Elias climbed the tower stairs, hearing Marcel's voice drifting downward low, urgent, pleading not with any man, but with something only he believed was listening. When Elias reached the final step, he stopped, frozen, watching Marcel press the parchment against an ancient locked cabinet, muttering that the answers were trapped inside waiting for him alone. A storm flash illuminated the room, revealing Marcel's face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, exhausted yet fiercely determined, a man willing to break every rule he once enforced to chase a truth only he saw. Elias whispered his name, soft, careful, but Marcel turned with such intensity that Elias stumbled back, realizing this wasn't the same man who once lectured about discipline and restraint. This was someone pulled by forces he couldn't articulate, caught between belief and madness, trying desperately to make the world align with whatever he'd witnessed in that sealed chapel. Lightning cracked again, and in that sudden light, Elias noticed something terrifying. The parchment wasn't covered in ink at all, but in thin, crimson strokes Marcel had drawn from his own trembling hand. Fear punched through Elias's ribs, yet he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't shout for help, watching as Marcel lifted the parchment like a torch, guiding him towards something only he understood. Below them, unaware of the tower's unfolding crisis, the other brothers attempted sleep, though many lay awake, sensing the monastery itself had begun to shift under the weight of one man's unraveling. Wind howled through cracked stone, candles flickered, and every man in the monastery felt the same thing, a moment gathering strength, like pressure behind glass, waiting for the final shatter. When the tower bell rang at dawn, no one knew who sounded it, but every brother rushed toward the courtyard, boots thundering across cold stone, hearts pounding with the same unspoken fear. And standing there in the center of the courtyard, illuminated by the first gray streaks of morning, was Brother Marcel, silent, soaked from the storm, clutching the parchment against his chest. He lifted his head slowly, eyes empty, voice steady as cracked granite, and declared to every man, "The reckoning has begun." Thomas lived at the edge of every hallway, a quiet presence moving like a thin thread through stone passages, performing duties with precision that made elders nod and novices whisper about the man no one truly knew. He carried ledgers with disciplined ease, his hands steady even when the monastery trembled with rumors, his steps soft enough to vanish behind echoes of chanting that rolled endlessly through the vaulted corridors each morning. Brothers often forgot he existed until he appeared beside them with requested scrolls, his expression unreadable, revealing nothing of the long hours he spent cataloging words written centuries before any of them were born. Thomas preferred places others ignored: the archive loft where dust drifted like slow snow, the narrow stairwell beneath the bell tower where cold air hummed against old iron, reminding him how far he lived from freedom. He never expected to become part of Marcel's unraveling, but whispers grew louder each night, and Thomas felt the monastery's attention shifting toward him gradually, like shadows learning to recognize a man they once overlooked. The first sign came when Brother Rowan asked him to review Marcel's midnight entries, a request spoken with forced calm, though Rowan's tightening jaw betrayed fear of what truth those pages might contain. Thomas accepted the task, knowing refusal held consequences, and followed Rowan to the council chamber, where the candles flickered violently, spilling distorted shapes across parchment stamped with Marcel's increasingly frantic marks. The symbols frightened Thomas not because of their meaning he could decipher none but because the strokes revealed a trembling desperation, the kind of pressure that made disciplined men abandon everything they once believed. He read silently as Rowan watched him, the room heavy with expectation, both men sensing the order was slowly turning its gaze toward Thomas, seeking answers he did not possess or desire. That night, returning to his narrow cot near the storeroom, Thomas found a folded scrap of parchment placed between his blankets, containing a single instruction written in Marcel's unmistakable hand. "Come to the tower." Fear tightened inside him like a knot pulled sharply. For Marcel never summoned anyone without purpose, and Thomas recognized the weight of such a message, understanding it would shape his role in whatever storm approached. He considered ignoring it, but the monastery functioned on obedience, and years under rigid hierarchy conditioned him to move when called, especially by a man whose authority overshadowed nearly every decision within those walls. The tower loomed against moonlit clouds when Thomas arrived, its stones slick with night mist, its narrow windows glowing faintly as though someone inside sheltered a secret flame too fragile to extinguish. Thomas ascended the stairs cautiously, each step creaking under the strain of centuries, until Marcel's voice drifted downward low, strained, and strangely pleading and like the commanding tone carried 3 years of rigid leadership. When Thomas reached the final platform, he found Marcel kneeling beside an open chest of forbidden manuscripts, his hands trembling as he pointed toward a cracked volume containing diagrams scrawled by long-dead scholars. Marcel's eyes locked onto Thomas with unsettling intensity, as though he'd been waiting not for assistance but for witness, someone to validate the revelation consuming him from within like slow-burning embers. "I need you," Marcel whispered, the words fragile, unfamiliar from a man who once spoke only in commands, revealing how deeply the vision had fractured his certainty and reshaped the authority he clung to. Thomas's voice barely carried when he asked what Marcel sought, though part of him feared the answer, fearing he had been summoned not for knowledge but to become part of a truth too heavy to escape. Marcel pressed the cracked volume into Thomas's hands, insisting its symbols matched the patterns etched into his own parchment, claiming that only Thomas's clarity and discipline could help decipher their hidden structure. Though Thomas felt unworthy of such responsibility, he recognized something darker beneath Marcel's urgency, a man drowning in his own revelation, clinging to the nearest hand regardless of the danger it posed. They worked until dawn, Thomas translating fragments while Marcel paced in tight circles, muttering about trials meant for men willing to confront truths buried beneath centuries of blind obedience. Each discovery tightened Marcel's obsession, and Thomas felt himself slipping deeper into a role he never sought, becoming the silent witness to a man's descent that threatened to drag the entire order down. By sunrise, Marcel collapsed onto a bench, exhausted, gripping Thomas's wrist with desperate strength as he insisted the brotherhood needed a reckoning, a moment where truth would burn away every comfortable illusion. Thomas pulled away gently, unsettled by the fervor in Marcel's gaze, sensing the older man had crossed a threshold from devotion into dangerous conviction, the kind that compelled men to drag others with them. Leaving the tower, Thomas descended the stairs with trembling hands, realizing that any attempt to distance himself had already failed, for Marcel had chosen him as bearer of a weight he could not refuse. As he stepped into the courtyard, exhaustion hung over him like smoke, sunlight exposing the fear etched across his features, drawing curious glances from brothers who had never seen him visibly shaken. He tried to resume his duties, but his thoughts kept circling the tower, the manuscripts, the urgency in Marcel's voice, realizing he now held knowledge capable of destabilizing their entire monastic order. Before noon prayers, Brother Thane intercepted him, demanding an account of his meeting with Marcel, his voice sharp, his expression lined with suspicion fueled by rumors spreading faster than discipline could contain. Thomas said nothing, unwilling to reveal Marcel's unraveling, but his silence only deepened suspicion, his refusal signaling to Thane that something within the order had begun to fracture beyond repair. By evening, the monastery felt different, quiet in ways that suggested men were listening for dangers they couldn't yet name, every footstep echoing with tension thick enough to bend even the strongest wills. Thomas kept to himself, but eyes followed him down every hallway, brothers whispering about the man Marcel had summoned under moonlit skies, fearing he had learned secrets too dangerous to ignore. As candles guttered in the refectory, Thomas sensed Marcel watching him from across the hall, gaze heavy with expectation, tethering Thomas to whatever revelation he intended to reveal next. That night, a storm rolled in from the coast, rattling shutters, shaking beams, filling the monastery with restless thunder that echoed like distant drums warning of an approaching battle between conviction and order. Thomas lay awake, staring at the rafters, knowing sleep wouldn't come, knowing Marcel would summon him again, knowing the truth creeping toward them had already chosen its path. At midnight, a knock sounded on his door, 3 soft taps that matched the rhythm Marcel used when summoning younger brothers for quiet counsel, signaling Thomas's next step had arrived. Thomas opened the door slowly, heart pounding, expecting Marcel but finding Rowan instead, face pale, voice strained, warning him that the abbots had decided to interrogate Marcel at dawn. Fear surged inside Thomas, sharp and cold, for he knew Marcel would not break easily, but he also knew the truth Marcel carried was volatile enough to ignite rivalries simmering for years. Rowan urged Thomas to stay silent, to avoid the council chamber, to remain unnoticed while the order tore itself apart trying to untangle Marcel's visions from his unraveling sanity. But Thomas could already see the path forming, one leading straight toward the council chamber, toward Marcel, toward a truth he had been forced to share and no warning would stop its arrival. He stepped past Rowan without speaking, walking into the stormlit courtyard, heading toward the tower once more, breath tightening with each step as if preparing for a battle he never asked to fight. Wine whipped his cloak, rain soaked his hair, and thunder cracked above him, but Thomas kept moving, knowing the next dawn would decide not only Marcel's fate but his own place in the Brotherhood's fractured truth. And as he reached the tower door, its hinges groaning open with a long, mournful creak, Thomas realized he was no longer a shadowed observer, he had become part of the storm itself. The council chamber felt colder than the rest of the monastery, as if centuries of judgment had seeped into the stone, waiting for the next man to stand beneath its weight with trembling breath. Dawn light pushed through narrow windows, cutting pale stripes across the floor where the abbots gathered, their robes still heavy with rain, their eyes sharpened by sleepless hours and the dread of coming truth. Marcel stood at the center of the room, shoulders squared, parchment clutched in one hand, jaw tight with the stubborn conviction of a man certain he'd glimpsed something larger than any doctrine allowed. Thomas entered quietly, though every head turned toward him, recognizing the man recently tied to Marcel's spiraling revelations, a figure the brothers watched with wary curiosity and unspoken expectation. Rowan hovered near the doorway, unable to stay away, fear etched across his expression as he watched two men he respected stand on the brink of a confrontation no training had prepared them for. Abbot Edrin began the proceedings, his deep voice reverberating off stone as he demanded Marcel explain his midnight rituals, hidden studies, and the growing disturbance rattling the monastery's disciplined structure. Marcel didn't flinch. Instead, he raised the parchment high, declaring it the blueprint of a divine reckoning, a set of symbols meant to strip falsehood from every man sheltering behind habit and tradition. Edrin's stern composure cracked slightly, frustration tightening his mouth as he demanded the parchment be surrendered, insisting no man could claim exclusive access to truth without threatening the unity binding their order. Thomas listened with pounding heart, recognizing how Marcel's obsession had inflated into something dangerous, drawing him deeper into the conflict whether he wanted it or not, pushing him toward an edge he feared crossing. Marcel stepped closer to the abbots, voice trembling not with fear but with fervor, proclaiming that the Brotherhood had grown complacent, clinging to structure instead of seeking the sharper clarity faith required. The room shifted as younger brothers exchanged glances, realizing Marcel's words carried the weight of accusation, pointing directly at them, suggesting their discipline masked decay rather than righteousness. Edrin signaled for Thomas to approach, forcing him into the center of scrutiny, asking plainly what Marcel had shown him, what symbols they'd studied, and whether he believed any held true meaning. Thomas's throat tightened, but he answered with careful honesty, describing only the visible details, the symbols, the diagrams, the late-night work, avoiding any interpretation that might fuel Marcel's dangerous conviction further. Marcel's eyes flashed at the partial truth, recognizing what Thomas withheld, and in that instant, the bond between them fractured, replaced by a tension born from betrayal and desperate need. Abbot Haran stepped forward next, presenting a locked iron box retrieved from the archive tower, claiming Marcel had broken protocol by accessing manuscripts banned for destabilizing generations of disciplined study. Marcel's voice rose, cracking with anguish, insisting those manuscripts weren't dangerous but illuminating, tools meant to awaken men from complacency, guiding them toward the trial he believed approaching. Rowan strode forward unexpectedly, revealing he'd seen Marcel tracing blood onto the parchment, his tone not accusatory, but pained, as if exposing a wound he wished someone else had discovered first. Gasps rippled through the room as Marcel stiffened, fingers curling tighter around the parchment, shame flickering across his face before pride surged in to shield him from vulnerability. Edrin demanded the parchment again, commanding Marcel to surrender it for examination, asserting authority sharpened by centuries of tradition, unwilling to let one man's obsession corrupt their entire order. Marcel refused a second time, stepping back, desperation bleeding through every line of his posture as he clutched the parchment to his chest like a lifeline slipping through his grasp. Thomas watched helplessly, realizing Marcel wasn't resisting the abbots, he was resisting collapse, fighting to preserve the last shred of meaning he believed separated revelation from madness. As tension reached breaking point, Haran signaled to senior brothers to intervene, their heavy footsteps echoing ominously as they approached Marcel, prepared to restrain him if necessary. Marcel's breath quickened, eyes darting between them and Thomas, searching for someone to validate the truth he believed he carried, but finding only fear and uncertainty staring back. With a sudden motion, Marcel unrolled the parchment, thrusting it toward the abbots, insisting they read the symbols aloud, as though their voices alone could unlock the meaning consuming him. Edrin took the parchment reluctantly, eyes scanning the markings, expression shifting from stern authority to grim recognition not of divine truth, but of a mind unraveling under unbearable pressure. He declared the symbols meaningless, a maze of frantic interpretations stitched together by a man who'd allowed private burdens to erode the discipline anchoring their brotherhood. Marcel staggered as though struck, disbelief twisting his features, his voice cracking as he demanded Thomas speak, hoping the young man would defend the vision he'd chased so desperately. Thomas lowered his gaze, unable to endorse something he feared would destroy Marcel entirely, and in that silence Marcel's final thread of composure snapped with heartbreaking clarity. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his head, whispering desperate prayers that tangled into raw pleas, his voice trembling with the realization that no man in the chamber trusted his revelation. The abbots ordered him removed gently, not as punishment but for safety, recognizing the once uncheckable brother had fractured under the very discipline he once enforced without mercy. As Marcel was led out, his gaze locked onto Thomas with haunting intensity, not hateful but hollow, as though watching a bridge burn between them in slow, agonizing silence. The remaining brothers exhaled collectively, but the relief felt fragile, overshadowed by the knowledge that their order had reached a breaking point with consequences none could fully anticipate. Edrin dismissed them, declaring the monastery would undergo immediate scrutiny, its routines tightened, its privileges restricted, and its hierarchy re-examined in light of Marcel's collapse. But as Thomas stepped into the courtyard, he sensed the chamber's battle hadn't ended, it had merely shifted, its aftermath coiling through the monastery like smoke seeking new places to cling. Rain softened into mist as Thomas walked alone, aware that the next steps would not be shaped by Marcel's unraveling, but by the choices the brotherhood made in its shadow. And somewhere deep inside the monastery, Marcel's voice continued echoing, broken, fervent, unforgettable warning that the reckoning he believed approaching might not have died with his collapse. The monastery awoke beneath a sky the color of ash, each man moving with the weight of yesterday's collapse pressing on his shoulders, the echo of Marcel's broken whisper lingering like a crack that wouldn't seal. Thomas stepped into the courtyard before dawn, feeling the air vibrate with unspoken tension, where every brother now watched him as though he carried fragments of Marcel's imploded certainty inside his silent thoughts. Edrin summoned the abbots at first light. The council gathered around a long oak table scarred by age, their faces drawn with the exhaustion of men preparing to rebuild order from shattered conviction. They declared strict isolation for Marcel, locking him in the infirmary's stone chamber under constant supervision, a decision made not from cruelty but fear of how far his unraveling might spiral without boundaries. Thomas was ordered to resume his duties, though nothing felt familiar anymore. Every shelf he touched, every corridor he walked trembling with the memory of Marcel's desperation burned into their cold stone. Rowan followed him closely throughout morning tasks, sensing a danger still simmering beneath the surface, as though unraveling, one man had loosened invisible threads holding the brotherhood together for decades. By midday, rumors spread faster than discipline could contain, novices claiming Marcel's warnings foretold the collapse of their order, elders insisting his madness proved the monastery had strayed from its founding purpose. Thomas found himself caught between factions forming silently, men seeking answers he did not possess, each insisting his time with Marcel granted insight into truths he feared even to contemplate. Evening brought storm winds slamming against the arches, rattling shutters, filling halls with restless murmurs, as each brother braced for the first night without the certainty Marcel once enforced through unwavering vigilance. Thomas tried sleeping but failed, his mind haunted by memories of Marcel gripping his wrist, whispering that revelation demanded sacrifice, words that felt heavier now that silence filled the tower. He finally walked through the darkened halls, breath echoing softly, drawn toward the infirmary by a pull he couldn't explain, compelled to see the man who had dragged him into chaos. A single lantern burned inside Marcel's chamber, illuminating the older man sitting upright against the wall, eyes shadowed yet disturbingly calm, as though acceptance had replaced the frantic fire consuming him earlier. Marcel greeted Thomas with a faint nod, voice roughened by exhaustion, asking not for forgiveness or validation, but simple companionship, a request revealing loneliness deeper than any madness. Thomas sat beside him, the silence stretching long between them, neither man willing to resurrect symbols or visions that had already carved irreversible fractures into the brotherhood. Marcel finally spoke, admitting his revelation had come during a moment of overwhelming fear, a night when he believed discipline alone had no longer silenced the doubts clawing at his spirit. He confessed he clung to the symbols because they felt like proof he wasn't losing himself, a desperate attempt to give shape to the pressure building inside years of rigid devotion. Thomas listened without judgment, recognizing that the monastery demanded perfection from men who were still human, their flaws buried until they erupted in ways no vow could contain. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, shaking window frames and mirroring the tremor in Marcel's voice as he admitted he feared becoming irrelevant long before the symbols consumed him. Thomas placed a steady hand on Marcel's arm, offering the quiet reassurance of presence, the kind of support that required no doctrine, proving companionship held more strength than hollow authority. Before dawn, Edrin entered the chamber, surprised to find both men awake, their quiet conversation having softened the tension that once threatened to tear the monastery apart entirely. He dismissed Thomas gently, acknowledging that whatever passed between them had steadied Marcel more effectively than any formal intervention, though the abbots would never openly admit such truth. As Thomas left, he noticed subtle changes within himself, a deeper understanding of how fragile even the strongest men could become, how easily purpose twisted into obsession under silent pressure. Morning broke with cold clarity, and the brothers assembled for prayers with renewed caution, aware the monastery stood at the edge of reinvention, requiring deliberate steps to avoid repeating its silent failures. Edrin addressed the full assembly, speaking with heaviness earned through crisis, acknowledging Marcel's collapse as a warning that no man should bear the weight of spiritual order alone. He announced new rotational responsibilities, shared authority among elders and novices alike, believing the brotherhood would find stability not through one man's discipline but through collective vigilance and humility. Some brothers resisted quietly, longing for the certainty Marcel once enforced, but even they recognized the necessity of change, watching Thomas with newfound respect shaped by proximity to collapse. Thomas resumed work in the archive, this time joined by Rowan and Thane, building a team rather than bearing responsibilities alone, realizing shared burdens softened the pressures once driving Marcel into isolation. As days passed, the monastery began to settle, yet faint tremors of uncertainty remained, particularly in the tower where Marcel's parchment once lay like a spark waiting for breath. One evening, Thomas climbed the tower steps again, not to chase visions but to ensure the space carried no lingering threat, lighting a single candle that cast warm clarity across the stones. He opened the cracked manuscripts carefully, recognizing the symbols no longer held meaning but served as reminders of how easily fear disguised itself as revelation when men felt unseen. Thomas locked the manuscripts away, sealing them not to hide truth but to prevent future brothers from mistaking desperation for divine instruction, guarding the order from repeating Marcel's path. He stepped outside as dusk settled, breathing cold air that tasted cleaner than it had in weeks, aware the monastery had survived its reckoning not through doctrine but through shared endurance. Marcel, though still secluded, regained fragments of stability, supported daily by Thomas, Rowan, and Edrin, who now understood leadership required compassion as much as discipline. Weeks later, Marcel walked through the courtyard for the first time, greeted by silent nods from men who once feared him, now recognizing him as a brother wounded by burdens too long ignored. Thomas walked beside him, steady and unafraid, aware their bond had shifted from obligation to solidarity, forged in the ruins of a chamber where illusions shattered and truths finally breathed. Night fell softly that evening, candles glowing warmly in windows, and for the first time in months, the monastery felt balanced, its men united not by fear, but by shared memory. And though Marcel's warning echoed faintly through their history, the brotherhood moved forward together, proving that even fractured men could rebuild sacred structures stronger than before.